You were part of Ken Starr's independent counsel team, which conducted a sweeping investigation into possible wrongdoing by President Clinton and the First Lady. At the time, you argued for aggressive questioning of the president. You did not take the position that President Clinton was immune from investigation. Since then, you have taken the opposite position. In fact, you have said that, and I quote, "If the president were the sole subject of a criminal investigation, I would say no one should be investigating that at all." What did you mean by that? And what are the circumstances where a sitting president could be subject to criminal investigation?
And I appreciate the sign there. Senator, the last sign I should have mentioned while it was up, the Second Amendment sign actually had a brackets around part of my quote, and I'm not sure if it was the exact quote, but this one, I just wanted to point that out.
Is this accurate?
Here's what I was saying, Senator. Let me explain it. This one. The last one may or may not have been accurate. I just wanted to point that out for the record. It had brackets for my quote. This one. So what happens after the Starr investigation? Then I worked 5.5 years in the White House. So let me just give you, if I can, some context here, and I'm going to get specifically to your question. So I work in the independent counsel investigation, and that is obviously difficult, controversial, a moment for our country that I wish hadn't happened. We all wish it hadn't happened. And I reflect on that. I wrote a Georgetown University Law Journal article in '99 reflecting on some of my thoughts about that. This seems to be a tendency of mine to go through an experience, write an article reflecting on it. And then I work in the Bush White House for 5.5 years. And I write an article in the Minnesota Law Review, Senator Klobuchar, in 2009, when President Obama is in office, I should point out. And I reflected on a number of things I had learned working in the independent counsel office and then working in the White House. And I thought there were a number of things Congress could take a look at that I had experienced. One of them was I proposed timelines for consideration of judicial nominees. I proposed a 180-day up or down vote for every judicial nominee. That was something that, from my experience, I thought would avoid controversy and have rules of the road set in advance, and I proposed that specifically for Congress to consider. Other aspects, I said, well, another thing I proposed was for Congress to consider whether it should look at Clinton versus Jones or the principle of Clinton versus Jones. So you call Clinton versus Jones and said a president is subject to civil suit while in office, the Paula Jones suit. That was a controversial decision, but the Supreme Court made clear at the end of the decision Congress could provide extra deferral of suits, not immunity, but deferral of suits for presidents if Congress so wanted. And so in the Minnesota Law Review article, I put out some ideas about whether Congress may want to think about that. And why did I do that? I think Senator Durbin asked yesterday, what changed that made me think about that from the time? What changed was September 11th. That's what changed. So after September 11th, I thought very deeply about the presidency. And I thought very deeply about the independent counsel experience. And I thought very deeply about how those things interacted. And I thought very deeply about seeing President Bush. When he came into the Oval Office on September 12, 2001 in the morning, President Bush said, "This will not happen again. This will not happen again." And he was of single-minded focus. Every morning for the next 7 years for President Bush was still September 12, 2001. Single-minded focus. And then thinking back to the independent counsel experience in August of 1998. So I proposed some ideas for Congress to consider. Here's the bottom line point. There were ideas for Congress to consider. They were not my constitutional views. If a case came up where someone was trying to say this is a constitutional principle, I would have a completely open mind on that, because I've never taken a position on the Constitution on that question. I've only put out proposals for you all to study, to think about the balance of a president fighting a war, leading a war, and a president subject to, say, ordinary civil lawsuits, as in the Clinton versus
Let
Jones
me ask
case.
you, you're becoming very good. You're learning to filibuster. But let me ask this question precisely. The Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that a president can be required to turn over information. It upheld the subpoena for the tapes of Oval Office conversations that revealed President Nixon's efforts to cover up the Watergate break-in. This, as you know, was U.S. v. Nixon. You have said that the Nixon case might have been wrongly decided. Was U.S. v. Nixon wrongly decided, in your view?
So that quote is not in context and is a misunderstanding of my position that's up there. I have repeatedly called U.S. v. Nixon one of the 4 greatest moments in Supreme Court history. So I've called that, the 4 I've always identified are Marbury versus Madison, Youngstown Steel, Brown versus Board of Education, and United States versus Richard Nixon. And why have I, Brown versus Board, by the way, the single greatest
Was
moment.
it rightly decided?
So I have said that, I've said yes, that the court's holding that a criminal trial subpoena to a president in the context of the special counsel regulations in that case for information, a criminal trial subpoena for information under the specific regulations in that case, I have said that holding is one of the 4 greatest moments in Supreme Court history. So not only I can explain how that misunderstanding came up, because I know there was a news story about that, and that's just not correct impression of my views. My views have been consistently. Why was it one of the greatest moments? It was one of the greatest moments because of the political pressures of the time. The court stood up for judicial independence in a moment of national crisis. That's what the Supreme Court, we need the Supreme Court to decide the things we can foresee. But one of the things that's really important for the Supreme Court, we're going to have crisis moments at the Supreme Court on things we can't even predict. And we need people on the Supreme Court who are prepared for that. And U.S. v. Nixon is...
My time's going to run out very quickly. Let me just ask you this. Can a sitting president be required to respond to a subpoena?
So that's a hypothetical question about what would be an elaboration or a difference from U.S. v. Nixon's precise holding.
That's right.
And I think going with the Justice Ginsburg principle, which is really not the Justice Ginsburg alone principle, it's everyone's principle on the current Supreme Court. And as a matter of the canons of judicial independence, I can't give you an answer on that hypothetical question.
So you can't give me an answer on whether a president has to respond to a subpoena from a court of law?
As my understanding is that you're asking me to give my view on a potential hypothetical, and that's something that each of the 8 justices currently sitting on the Supreme Court, when they're sitting in my seat, declined to decide potential hypothetical cases. I can tell you about the U.S. v. Nixon precedent, and I did, about Chief Justice Burger's role in forging a unanimous opinion, and really all the justices worked together on that. But Chief Justice Burger, who had been appointed by President Nixon, writes the opinion in U.S. v. Nixon, 8-0, Rehnquist was recused, 8-0, ordering President Nixon to disclose the tapes in response to a criminal trial subpoena. A moment of crisis, argument, I think July 8th, 1974, they decided 2 weeks later. Really important opinion. Moment of judicial independence. Important precedent of the Supreme Court. But how that would apply to other hypotheticals, I best, as a sitting judge and as a nominee, follow the precedent of the nominees who've been here before, and as a matter of judicial independence, not give you a precise answer on a hypothetical that could come before me.
Understand. Thank you very much for being forthcoming. Appreciate it.